Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The New Agora.
Hello,
I'm Athenianos,
I'm Matthew Brown.
and we have a very special guest today to help us discuss Aristotle, also known as Aristoteles. And I'll let him introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Filip Karaivanov, third year at uni, and I'm studying with these gentlemen here ancient philosophy.
Yeah. Philip, why don't you tell us where you're from?
I'm from Bulgaria originally, from the capital, Sofia.
Very
Nice.
cool.
Sophia.
Yes.
Interesting.
The city of wisdom,
Yes.
if the translation is believed, yeah.
Have you been?
No, I was just commenting on the Sophia aspect of the Philia Sophia of wisdom. Philosophy students.
Right. Why don't we jump into it?
Let's.
Aristotle has obviously written a crap ton of books. But today we're going to be discussing his posterior analytics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And particularly, right, the last part where he's searching, or he's trying to explain how we develop an understanding of knowledge, right? I don't know. Do you guys think it'd be helpful to read that short passage just to give everybody an understanding of what we're working off of?
Yeah, sure, can do.
Can you do
This
it?
passage here?
Yes.
Now, we have said earlier that it is not possible to understand through demonstration if we are not aware of the primitive immediate principles. But as to knowledge, gnosis of the immediates, one might puzzle both whether it is the same or not the same, whether there is understanding of each, or episteme, or rather understanding of the one and some other kind of thing or the other, and also whether the states are not present in us but come about in us, or whether they are present in us but escape notice. Well, if we have them, it is absurd, for it results that we have pieces of knowledge more precise than demonstration, and yet this escapes notice. But if we get them without having them earlier, how might we become familiar with them and learn them from no pre-existing knowledge? For that is impossible, as we said in the case of demonstration too. It is evidently impossible then, both for us to have them and for them to come about in us when we are ignorant and have no such state at all. Necessarily, therefore, we have some capacity, but do not have one of a type which will be more valuable than these in respects of precision.
Yeah, well, no, I think it's an absolutely fascinating part of the posterior analytics because he sets up this, I guess, a dilemma, right? He's asking something to do with the Minos paradox, which I believe you guys have talked about before.
Mm-hmm.
How could you gain knowledge of something if you don't have any prior knowledge of it? And he's referring there to demonstration, which I believe what he means by that is syllogism, right? Or induction. Those are the two methods he talks about in to do with acquiring knowledge. And he's pointing out that you must know something before you could begin reasoning about those things. So to put in more philosophical terms, if you have a deductive argument, you need to know if the premises of the argument are true or false. And he's asking, how do you know this? And the dilemma, of course, is you either already know them, so that's the innate knowledge, that's the Plato example, or you gain the knowledge. But he rejects both alternatives because he says you cannot already know them, because then they should be even more accurate, as he puts it, or even more present in your mind than a deductive argument, than a demonstration, which clearly they're not because you don't know them, right? If you have to recollect them in Plato's case, right? But Aristotle is saying that seems absurd to him. How could you have to recollect it if it's more obvious than a demonstration? So I guess maybe if you guys want to talk about that first alternative, because he's directly clashing with Plato here.
Sure. So the first alternative, remind me again, sorry, just
That you already have knowledge and that you're relearning it.
right? Innate ideas.
Okay, so like the like mathematical knowledge, like the knowledge of the forms.
Exactly.
Okay, kind of foundational things that you that make up what your premises are. That you use that to then lead into your conclusion.
Yes, kind of like the axioms in a mathematical proof.
Right. Okay.
And I think the axioms is an important point to note because Aristotle does believe, right, that you gain knowledge through deduction in some way, but it's a different kind of induction than Descartes' deduction,
Hmm.
because, well, Descartes may say, oh, it's purely like Aristotle believes that we still gain knowledge through our sensory perceptions of things, and then from those things we can deduce other things, um, and but Aristotle has this posits that there's these axioms, these starting principles from which then we expand upon and are able to deduce further things. And it's interesting because he seems to think that those axioms that we get, those starting principles, as opposed to Descartes, where he just basically sits in a dark room and reflects on them without having any sensory perception, Aristotle actually thinks you get those axioms from interacting with the world, and experiencing it and living through it, which I think is a very interesting distinction between him and Descartes.
Right, but isn't looking to the world, that's inductive reasoning, right? That's knowledge that you gain from experience.
Right.
How does that then take the position of sort of fundamental axioms, right?
Right.
That then operate as the
Well,
basis of a strong syllogistic argument.
See, this is where I find Aristotle the most confusing.
Right.
Is because he relies so much on both deduction and deductive reasoning, and yet at the same time he thinks knowledge comes from experience. And the way that the only way that I can posit that he can reconcile these two things is the idea that when we first interact with the world, we just have these like animal experiences with it. They don't actually mean anything to us, or we're not able to orient ourselves around what they are. And then little by little, the more we experience them, the more they layer on top of each other, we're able to grasp some kind of
Universal principle. Right.
that we're able to then use to further knowledge of other things. But again, I have a lot of trouble with how he reconciles those two things. So
are we ultimately left in the position then that we don't have any solid grounding for the premises of any deductive argument that we put forward, other than like mathematical or like abstract principles? Is that where he's going with this?
No, I don't think so. And well, I actually wanted to ask you about the thing that they're not reconcilable, and because I don't think I quite understood your point about induction.
yeah,
But I did want to say before that you are correct in that the rationalists like Descartes, when they ask the question of axioms,
right,
they would basically stop their inquiry there. So
Right.
once you reach a point of talking about axioms, they would say this is something that you must know in order to begin your inquiry in the first place, which is sort of similar with Plato's account of recollection, although they are a little bit distinct because innate ideas is not quite what Plato says, right? He still has this previous life where you have to discover the forms. But Aristotle doesn't think that, right? He doesn't think that you stop with the axioms. He wants to know, how do you know these axioms? Or I
Right.
think he calls them first principles, right?
right.
I think the Greek is arche or something along those lines.
Sure.
I don't know my pronunciation. Somebody will probably correct me on it. But yeah, he thinks it's sense perception. That's what gets you the knowledge of the premises, right? It's the senses. And I believe, to your point about induction, it's the same thing with induction, right? So induction is, for him, the same as a syllogism in terms of where do you get the first principles in an inductive argument. And he says, well, I mean, I think for us, that one's probably even more obvious, right? That you get them from experience, right? An inductive argument is entirely based on experience. So that's his sort of way out of the dilemma.
Okay.
I would like to point out he does say you cannot acquire the knowledge from somewhere else. So he's trying to posit like a middle ground, and that's his second point. Because remember in the passage you read that he says they're not innate, which is what we've just said, but they're also not just acquired, again, because he says, well, that's the same problem. Right, in a demonstration, in a syllogism, you acquire the knowledge. And what was the problem? Where do you get the steps? Where do you get the first principles? And now we have the same problem. If you say, well, you get them from another demonstration, right? Well, where do you get the first principles? So he's saying that alternative does not work because it's an ad infinitum. That's why he
keeps going.
Exactly, to the infinite. So that's why he puts in this idea of a capacity. A rational faculty that you must have, something that can interpret the sense perception.
And that's, I guess, so when you that rational capacity is what you would use when you look to the world, you observe several phenomena, and you use that rational capacity to abstract the principle from your experiences, and that's then used as your first principles.
Exactly, yes. So for him, that's something that's
fair.
Better than innate knowledge, right? It's less accurate, so it makes sense why you wouldn't immediately know it. But it's not as accurate as a demonstration.
Right, and again, to what you said, Athen, about that kind of animal instinctive reaction to the world, you don't necessarily arrive at that universal principle without the practice of your capacity for reason, which you have to train and practice and, I guess, intentionally use. It's not like you said, we have a capacity for it, but not an instinct for reason. Is that?
Yes. So your capacity for reason is not perfect. It's not the same as an innate idea.
Otherwise, it would be like that. You wouldn't.
Exactly.
You'd have an experience of the world and then abstract immediately the universal principles from all the things that you're experiencing, rather than having to set yourself at the task of looking to the world and thinking about it.
Precisely, yes. If you already know, and you were saying that, like, universals, right? That's the big topic that's sort of lingering in the background of this knowledge debate. It's exactly that. It's about universals, like,
or generalized, maybe I should say. Yeah.
Yes, well, he would say universals. It's just that, yes, you're generalizing to the universal, right, instead of already knowing it. Because for him, if you already know it, then it should be more present in your mind, like a demonstration, right? It makes no sense that you have this sort of, he would say, like an inexplicable recollection. You know, why would you be recollecting this if it's so obvious?
Right. See.
At least that's what I understood.
No. That makes sense.
So right in he says that all animals have a connate discriminatory capacity, which is called perception, and perception is present in them, and that in some animals retention of, I'll just read it actually, in some animals retention of the perception comes about, but in others it does not come about, and that for those that it does not come about, so for which they do not retain that perception, they have no knowledge outside of their perceiving or their perception. But for those who are able to retain their perceptions, I guess, they retain some kind of knowledge. Right. Let me just.
Yeah.
I jumped around a lot, but basically,
no rush.
All animals have the capacity to perceive things, right? But there's a difference between those that can retain those perceptions and those that cannot. And those that cannot have no knowledge of things outside of that animalistic perception, and I guess that's what I was trying to get at in the beginning when I'm talking about, like, you're just seeing the world and reacting to it versus those that can retain it. And then from that retaining of the perception, he says, comes memory. And then from memory comes experience when it's the same thing, when it's related to the same thing. And then and from having many experiences, you get that whole universal, I guess, which is what we were just talking about. And then from that whole universal, you get skill and understanding. And I think that's kind of what we were just talking about. This part I find very difficult to understand what he's talking about. Then he says, thus the states neither belong to us in a determinate form nor come about from other states that are more cognitive, but they come about from perception. Okay, clear about that. But then he says, as in a battle, when a rout occurs, if one man makes a stand as another does, then another until a position of strength is reached, and the soul is such as to be capable of undergoing this. I have a really hard time understanding what he, like, I understand that he's saying it's not that you recall knowledge that you previously had, and it's not that it comes from nothing, it's from perception. But what do you make of the battle and route analogy?
I actually really enjoyed the analogy.
You did?
Yes, we're seeing a little bit of.
Please explain it to me, because
you
I
know,
have a lot of issues.
Writing like his master Plato, right? A bit of an analogy here. I think it is describing what we were talking about in more detail, I suppose. He's saying that you've got one man routing at first, right? That's the first thing that you're perceiving. That's the particular, if we want to use the proper terminology, right? You've got what you would say is like a sensible particular. You're like a table, for example. You're seeing one table, you're recognizing it, you're observing it, right? That's your sense perception. And he's saying that the soul has this capacity, right? That's how he ends that sentence he has. This is something that the soul is capable of, like we're out in battle. So that's the capacity for reason that we talked about. So as you're seeing more and more tables, that's how you start to generalize or abstract out to the universal. And this is what he would describe like a rout in battle, that you have this like formation falling apart. So it's like one by one, the whole thing comes together. That is what I'm assuming he's
understand.
meaning.
So that analogy a little bit, like not how it relates to the soul, but literally understand what he's talking about in the analogy. So when you have a battle, he's saying that you kill one person, and then as you start to kill more, then the route takes shape and forms. Is that
So I think so.
what he's saying?
So, as in a battle, when a rout occurs, if one man makes a stand, another does, and then another, until a position of strength is reached. Right? So, I think it's like, so you have one man takes a stand, and another joins him, and another joins him, and then another joins him, and then you have a strengthened, confident
I see.
position, right? Kind of like, so that, like with induction, right? So, you say this one is white, this one is white, this one is white, this one is white. The more white swans you see, the more confident you can be in your generalized observed principle that all swans are white.
Or in the syllogism, although it's a little bit trickier, but all men are mortal, right? Where would you get that premise from? Well, one man's mortal, another man's mortal, third one's mortal. You get the formation. That's all men are mortal. That's the original formation is restored in the battle, right? And that's what he would say. Right. So you get this principle, and then he adds this in, right? The soul is capable of this, right? So that's interesting because we have the soul's our rational capacity. We're capable of reforming the battle line, if you want to put it that way.
Okay, now I understand it. See, I'm not a military guy, so I had trouble with that, but now I understand it much more. So it's. You get the premises. He's saying you get the premises of deductive argument through induction.
That's what it sounds like. That's what that sounds like to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we're not in that much of a different position today, really, are when we think about it. Because if we go back to our philosophy of science class, which we were talking about earlier, when we were talking about Karl Popper's solution to the problem of induction.
It has to be falsified.
Falsification, right? Because then, so you see one instance of a black swan, you can deduce from one instance of a black swan that not all swans are white. You don't need to observe many instances of it, right? But
how does that relate to?
It relates to it because, well, your deductive argument, right? The premises for your deductive argument are still arrived at through induction. So it sort of helps with the problem of induction a little bit, but not totally, because you're still having to rely on experience in a way to arrive at the premises of your inductive argument. Which is what you've just said that Aristotle is saying. Aristotle is saying you arrive at your premises for your syllogism through
Explain
induction.
one more time how Popper's falsification theory relates to that.
So, because what we're trying to do in scientific investigation is to rely on something solid, right?
Right.
And so the problem of induction was, well, how do you justify the use of inductive reasoning? Well, through inductive reasoning, you say, because it worked, it provided us with this answer at this time in history.
Right.
Right. So it's then circular.
Problem of induction. Yes.
Right. Yeah. And so that's not solid. And so Karl Popper's, and I'm not an expert on this, so correct me if I get this wrong. As I understood it, his suggestion was, well, you use deductive reasoning, right, by relying on falsification rather than verification. So you take a hypothesis and you try and disprove it, rather than look to the world to verify it, right? Because then when you come across a falsifying instance, you can then deduce from that singular instance the falsity of your hypothesis.
Yes.
Right. But you're still looking to the world for that, for the instances of your premises that build up your deductive argument. So it's a
I see.
It's a partial solution to the problem of induction, but not a total. And I stress not an expert on that point. That's just from my very loose understanding of what we went through. But that's what you're asking if Aristotle is saying. And so I was trying to give that as an example.
Understood. I get it now.
Well, even the falsifiable instance, like the black swan, that's also from sense perception.
Yes, yeah.
Right. So, yeah, I think your description of Popper is correct. He tries to solve... Well, the problem of induction is really a problem for science, at least in the way he tackles it, and he tries to say that science can work deductively. But yeah, you're right. Aristotle is essentially saying if we drill down to the first principles, everything would have to come from sense perception.
Right.
It makes no sense for it not to come from sense perception, and I think modern-day scientists would probably agree with Aristotle.
But that's very interesting, right? Because he, like, I know Descartes was way after him, but Descartes just took his position and said, okay, I'm kind of with you, but except these first principles are not through, sense perception. We get them through, I don't know, meditation, and reflection.
I don't know though, because when I was reading that, right?
Which one?
Well, the meditations.
Yeah.
Right. When he lands on, the famous "I think therefore I am."
Yeah.
Right. Like it's certainty of experience, and certainty of nothing else other than the fact of experience itself. Right. I cannot be deceived that I'm having this experience, or I may be deceived about the content of my experience, right? So the men across the road might be automatons, I might not have hands,
Right.
This might be a dream, but the fact of experience is certain to me, and therefore I know I am, right? That's still experience, right? That's like, I know it's like meditative, rational, but like it's still inductive in a very strange way because
I guess, but it's not relying on your senses.
I would say I understand what you're saying about the first principle for Descartes, but he does the way he justifies the cogito, right? He justifies it by reason.
Right.
Because for him, it would be a contradiction to be able to be deceived if you don't exist and nothing is being deceived, right? I suppose yes, you could interpret him, if you want to give him like an Aristotelian take, you could say that he's still relying on some sort of experience, right? Because even the translation is not actually the most accurate translation, as far as I'm aware, is not "I think, therefore I am," right? It's "I am, I exist." That's how he wanted to phrase it, right? It's a there is no thinking, right? It's not a step in an argument. He doesn't like that because that's room for doubt. That's room for the demon to come in and deceive you, right? Because you don't know, we use logic, obviously, but here we're talking about a really powerful entity, and we don't even know where our logic comes from. So he says that's not certain, which is quite interesting, right? I mean, he's a rationalist saying the logical stuff is not certain. He's saying, but I have this experience that I am at the moment here. I exist, and that's why it's in the first person as well, because I cannot justify yours existence, right? The demon could fool me about you.
Right.
It can fool me about myself, because if I'm not here, then it's not fooling anything.
You could be the only thing in the universe having the experience of everything else.
Yes, well, that's where the first meditation leaves him.
Yeah.
You have to imagine Descartes was thinking about, or at least influenced by Aristotle, when he was coming up with meditations.
Probably.
So, well, he rejects a lot of Aristotle's metaphysics,
Right.
which I know we're not gonna discuss today, but I think it's coming up in
Next week
or the week after. Yeah, he completely changes the game there, because prior to him, all the medieval philosophers had assumed some sort of an Aristotelian outlook. So he changes that.
That's interesting.
But coming back to Aristotle's position that we get these first principles from perception, how plausible do you think that is?
Well, I mean, it's a little plausible, and you have to start somewhere, right? And
Right.
I guess that's what we have in the first instance, right? We have our experience and our capacity for reason. I guess, I mean, like, there is...
But then how different is it from Plato's theory of recollection if you think about that, you think about prior knowledge in terms of being capacity for knowing, and that's what you had prior. How different is it really from Plato's explanation, if you think about it in that way?
Well, I do want to say that I think sometimes people draw quite a distinct line between Plato and Aristotle, and I'm not so convinced of that distinction, because after all, I think it's around 20 years that they were together discussing the ideas, if I've got my chronology right, which I probably don't. But, they were discussing these ideas, and it's not as if, Plato wasn't aware of the criticisms Aristotle put forth, and I'm sure he was developing his ideas in empirical science. But, well, what's interesting, which I recently discovered and I thought was quite interesting, is when you compare Plato with, like, Descartes, for example, since we've been talking about him, Plato's idea of recollection still has this idea of perception in it. Because how would you know the universals, right? In this life, you know them through reason. But he feels the need to say there's a previous life where you perceive them. You perceive the forms. Which is quite interesting, because nobody else, as far as I'm aware, in the rationalist tradition, like Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, they don't make that recollection idea, right? They would say, yes, you have innate ideas, you have axioms that are in your mind, but they don't say that you must have had a previous life where you witnessed these things. So, in that sense, I think Plato is closer to Aristotle, but it also, the upshot of that, I think, is that Aristotle's theory, to answer your initial question, might be more plausible. because he simply says there is no need to suppose this other previous life where we perceive these universals. We could actually just perceive the particulars here and then generalize to the universals using this unique capacity in us of reason.
Well, so because I guess what you're doing when you're generalizing to the universals is making a pass at the observation of the patterns of reality, right? The logic of the universe, right? So I guess, I mean, that's, I guess that I think there will always be like a gap or an uncertainty in your attempts at that, but they would make pretty good attempts at first principles, right? Like those generalizations of observation to then use as your premises for deductive arguments.
Right, and I think he'll be open to refinement.
Sure.
Because for him, it's not this ineffable, knowledge like it is in Plato. Like,
Well, because he talks about skill as well. So like when you read that bit, a principle of skill and of understanding. So like with his virtue ethics, right? When he's talking about you have to practice, right? You have to practice being courageous. You have to
Virtue's a habit.
Yeah, exactly. It's like so. I imagine like and so I don't see why the capacity for reason would be any different, right? Or your attempts at refining your general principles of reality, like you practice the skill dialectically, right, with other people in argumentation, and refine your, very similar to the scientific method, right? Like you refine your hypotheses by bumping them up against one another.
But is it a dialectic process or is it an individual process? Because I understood it more as an individual process rather than a dialectic.
Fair.
Yes, that's quite interesting because for Plato's theory of recollection, you have to have a teacher, it seems like. He says the ideas are in you, but he's always got this, dialectical idea of someone is drawing the ideas out of you, like the Socratic dialogues. But for Aristotle, it seems to be more like a subconscious process that's always occurring, right? Your capacity for reason is always, like you don't generalize because you're reasoning, right? You don't reason with the child about, for example, what a dog is, right? The child just sees instances of dogs, and then in the background, its mind is generalizing into a universal dog. So there is an interesting difference between Plato and Aristotle, I think.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. It seems like it's less about talking with somebody else and having somebody else show you the way to recall these things, and it's much more about you just engaging with the world, and continuing to use your sensory perceptions and then building like blocks almost each time you use these to kind of move from the stage from perception to memory to experience to the universal, and then to understanding. That's at least the way I saw it. It's like I think about it. When you come to a new city or go to a new place for the first time, right? And when you're first there, you don't understand anything, like where things are, and you're very confused, and I don't know if you remember, like the first time you came to Edinburgh, the first time you walked into the library, right? You're like, where is everything? I'm very lost. And then you notice that as you kind of continually go to these spaces, then even 6 months later, your orientation of those places is much sharper, and there is no, oh, where am I? Where is everything? What is this place? It's much clearer to you in your head, and you have a much sharper knowledge of where things are in relation to other things, and so that's how I see um, the exercise of knowledge as Aristotle describes it here.
Because I guess that's kind of happening in the background as
Yeah,
you're having these experiences. Not necessarily you're not necessarily walking into a building going, "Oh, I'm going to add to my model of this building I have in my head today." You just have an experience with the building or the city or the town
right,
and become increasingly more familiar with it.
right. And the first instance where you go in or the town or whatever is akin to the animal experience of perception without at that very first time. Um, it's like what I would imagine, the world is to like a fly or a goldfish or a grasshopper, right? They just the entire time they're just like it's like they're seeing things for the very first time. They say the goldfish has the 3 second memory. So,
That always changes. It was 5 seconds.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it is now.
but I mean, like, they would continually, they must their entire lives, which probably very short.
I don't think they can live for a while. I think people have goldfishes for quite
That
few
is like
years.
a couple days.
Goldfish live for more than a couple of days. What do you mean flies?
No, goldfish. How long do goldfish?
Definitely more than a couple of days. Unless you're really bad at looking after goldfish.
10 to 15 years.
A
Yeah,
couple of days.
With proper care, 30 years. Couple days, 30 years.
Yeah, you need
actually
to,
longer than a cat's life. That's crazy.
You
I
need to
didn't know
not
that.
have goldfish. I'll call the animal
Think about
services
that.
on
30 years of seeing things for the first time.
Well,
I'm
that,
not sure if that's true. I'd like double check the fake goldfish memory.
yeah,
thing.
maybe we should not use inaccurate examples as
How
we're prone to do.
I
what I type
apologize
in,
to the
how-
goldfish community.
How long is a goldfish memory?
Yeah. Well, just type in goldfish memory. Google will know what you're talking about. Or the internet.
I'm gonna go 10 minutes. That's my guess right there.
3 months.
All right.
I think highly of goldfish.
Optimistic for the goldfish community, right?
Okay, this is on livescience.com.
That sounds trustworthy.
One common saying even claims these creatures have a mere 3 second recall. However, this is completely a myth,
Oh,
despite its lack of scientific backing. Blah blah blah.
How
In
would you
re-
test a goldfish memory?
In reality, goldfish have much longer memories, spanning weeks, months, and even years. And the science to back this up has been around for more than 60 years. Okay, well, bees have apparently bees have the shortest memory, 2.5 seconds.
I mean, they're very busy.
Yeah. I wonder if the queen bee has a bigger memory because she's constantly telling them, you know.
She just sits in her arsehole, Dad.
The queen bee has the best life out of everybody. She's just like reaping the benefits while all these worker bees are like forever, they're like literally the programmed to just be slaves for her. Hey, go, have something to say about that?
Well, socialists and communists often make comparisons to bee and ant colonies and look at how efficient they are. And you're right, there usually is one person reaping the benefits of all of that. So maybe it's not a bad analogy. Anyway, back to the Greeks.
yes, before we get derailed too much, yeah, even if we grant
Stalin and
animals
Lenin are
memories,
queen
right?
bees.
Oh,
No further comment. That's another podcast.
too much bee talk.
Back to the ancients. Yes, please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the passage that you read about Aristotle and memory, even if you grant them longer memories, right? The goldfish and the animals, yeah, you still have this idea of generalization and the rational capacity, which he identifies to be primarily a human trait in his philosophy.
Fair.
There we go. We brought it back to to Aristotle.
Yeah, that was good because I was going down a very different path,
Yeah.
and you brought me back into to Greece.
Well, have you heard of that saying that if you go on Wikipedia, right, on any page, you could always, following the links, go back to the philosophy page.
Really?
Apparently, around 90% of the pages are connected to philosophy in some way.
That's pretty cool.
Really? We used to do a game in high school where it was called like something like Wikipedia something. Anyway, the point of the game was you start on a Wikipedia page, and then you have a starting, and then you have a goal page, and it's a competition between two people or multiple people. How fast can they get from one Wikipedia page to the goal Wikipedia page by clicking on all the links
Mm-hmm.
that they have, like, you know,
Right.
related words.
As in, like, you pick the word that you think is going to.
No,
Get
yeah.
you
So
closer to the
you
goal
let's say you start off with like goldfish,
Yep. Yeah.
and then the goal is communism,
Okay.
and you
Right.
have to
Following the links on the Wikipedia
follow the
page.
links on the goldfish page, like because they have like they'll say like, oh, a goldfish or an animal in the sea, and then the sea will be another Wikipedia page. So you click on the sea Wikipedia page, and you go down in the sea Wikipedia page, and maybe it says something about hierarchy, and then you click on the hierarchy page, and then I don't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well,
get
we
the-
showed you how you're going to get there. You're going to get to the bees, and then from the bees, the analogy of the bees, you're going to get to communism, right?
And back to communism.
All roads lead back to
Why not all of them?
Greece.
Okay, cool. So that was the posterior analysis.
Well, are you guys happy with that?
I mean, I don't have much else to say um, on that personally.
Yeah, I guess I could add something to the point you were making about virtue ethics and his ideas on ethics. I think that's quite interesting because he always starts with sort of a common knowledge that people have, which I think is so interesting that a lot of philosophers don't do that. Like, they doubt the common knowledge that people have, but he would always start with that. He would say, what do people believe, right, is good, for example, and then he would reason on from that, which shows this idea that he thinks other people are also rational. They've also have sense perception. They've also viewed the world, and they could abstract out and come up with some idea that a philosopher should reason even more about that and try and abstract to a higher universal, if you would. And it's interesting because in logic, the text that we're looking for this week, he doesn't have that, right? He even says at one point, it's like, nobody before me has looked into logic, right? There's no common viewpoint to start from. So I think here it's quite interesting that he sort of starts from the beginning, right? And he has to like talk about first principles, like, where do I actually start from? Because in all other disciplines, it's always somebody has said something before him.
That is very interesting.
Yeah, so I thought that was an interesting point. And of course, also, I mean, we've got to mention at some point the influence of biology, right? Because he's influenced by empirical science. So, of course, he sees, an individual animal, and then you could get a species from that animal, and you could get a genus, right? So that's how he views this gaining knowledge of universals, as opposed to like Plato's mathematical viewpoint, where I think you probably talked about the geometric example in the Meno, where the slave boy is being taught, right? So you could clearly see in the examples they use where they're coming from, right? One is more mathematical, whilst the other is scientific.
So I guess, would you say that whereas Plato works from starting points, let's say, and then gets to particulars from the universals, and it seems like Aristotle is looking at particulars and then reasoning his way from those particulars to geniuses or universal concepts.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, for Plato, you cannot recognize the particulars without knowing the universals. Like, you have to have the concept in your mind, right? There's the example of equality as well. Like, how could you know two things are equal in this world when they're not perfectly equal, right? You have to have the concept of equality in your mind beforehand. For Aristotle, it's the complete opposite.
See, that's quite interesting to me because I find that I kind of have this thing whenever I'm thinking, it's like, oh, but what's the, what's the universal thing that can, like, I remember all the time, like, learning languages. You're looking for, like, the rule that applies where you could, use that for, you know, um, other things. And often I found that the best way to get that is not to look for that in the very beginning, but to look at all of these individual things. And then once you have all these particulars, look for like patterns or universals that come from those particular uh, things.
So kind of like tacit knowledge, like because I had like a similar story with doctors or like people who are involved in medicine, right? So they go through their training, right? They learn all the details about biology and all the details about particular illnesses and particular diseases. But then when they go into practicing, they see tens and hundreds and then thousands of patients. I think this was sort of back. Well, no, I guess it would still count today. But they realize themselves, or those who are paying attention to how they're diagnosing things, that it's like through pattern recognition,
right.
sort of subconscious almost, the familiarity of being exposed to like 100 or thousands of different kinds of the same skin condition or the same liver condition, and looking at the different features and abstracting those general patterns. So, but not from that necessarily like consciously directing yourselves at it, but from that kind of like tacit, involved in the process, involved in the endeavor, like when you're learning a language,
Right.
looking for those rules that you can use.
Well, how do you derive a universal if you haven't already, had contact with the specific particulars that concern that universal? Right? How would you know what the universal of an animal is if you've never seen an animal?
Right. And that's why Plato suggests that you have seen it.
Right.
Right. That was what I was saying earlier, that he agrees with Aristotle, at least on this much, that you have to have perceived it. It's not like Descartes' notion of just something that's innate, just sitting there in your mind. It's like, no, you have perceived it. That's why he talks about a previous life. But the whole question, I guess, between them is that necessary? Like, is it necessary that you have seen it before? Or could it be that you have discovered it now?
See, here's the interesting thing is, let's just take Plato and let's say he's right that we have seen an animal before, right? Our idea that like we point to a dog and say that's an animal, that relies on specific things in our language that we have established that particular thing, that particular category or species we label as animal and whatever, dog, but so if we didn't have that language of something, if there was no language to kind of guide us to these things, then how would Plato's theory of recollection work? Because yes, we may have seen that, we may have seen the form, let's say, of the animal, but unless we have the language to articulate and classify that thing, how are we supposed to, like, what would that leave us with if there was no language to help us classify? You understand what I'm saying?
Well, there wouldn't be any classification.
Like Aristotle at least helps us understand how we would use language, because he says, oh, you look at all these things and then you see the similarities, I guess, and you see the uniqueness, and then you can then label, okay, that thing is, the animal, because they all fall into this category, because I've observed a lot of these particulars, and they all fall into this category of animal. But with Plato, he says, oh, no, you already know. You've already seen the animal, right? But he doesn't actually explain how then you get the language to classify that as an animal and how that developed.
Well, I think that's also interesting because of the recent development, well, I don't know how recent they are, but Noam Chomsky's ideas about language. Because as far as I'm aware, and this is a field where I haven't even looked into it, right? But as far as I'm aware, right, Chomsky has this idea that the syntax of a language, right, is it appears like it's something that you know from quite a young age, and maybe it's even ingrained into you, which is, I guess, what Plato would also say about language, perhaps, that it's something that you must have it in you in some way. Whilst Aristotle, I believe, is a conventionalist about language,
Right.
where it's more what you were just describing. It's something that we've just made up to describe the world.
But then how'd they reconcile the fact, like Chomsky and Plato reconcile the fact that we have many languages, and sometimes languages can refer to something very specific, and sometimes different languages will not have words to refer to those specific things. Or like there may be something where language has to then invent a term to refer to something specific that it didn't have in the beginning, or was lacking a term that referenced that particular subset or category.
Well,
could just be adaptive to context.
mhm.
Right? Like you have these different languages manifesting in different cultural.
Right, but even so, like, let's say you have a language, and because there hasn't been this experience of a certain category of things, there was no need for this word,
right,
or this word to describe this category. But then when you come into contact with this thing, like in Europe they didn't have potatoes until, they went to South America. So, they didn't have a word for potatoes. And then, once you have the experience of these things that are similar to potatoes, then you need a word for it. And that's, let's say that's the case. Well, doesn't that fit more and prove more that, in line with Aristotle's, that you have all these experiences, right? Like the first instance of the potato is like that first perception that, without the memory, that first base layer. Then once you come to know potatoes a little more and you recall the same thing, then you can establish, okay, category, potato. So even, like, doesn't that fit more into Aristotle's method of how we gain knowledge and
But isn't Plato's argument, and this is where I'm a little unsure, isn't Plato's argument simply that you've had that experience
we've already experienced potatoes.
just previously? And this is where because I've been reading, like as you were saying beforehand, I was reading the Timaeus over the last week, and when he's describing how the craftsman, the demiurge, uses the forms as a model, and he's creating the souls of man, right? That he then exposes the souls to the form, to all that which is, to the form. So my question is Plato's argument that with the theory of recollection, that you've already had these experiences, is it that people have already had those experiences in reality of things that are real, or is it a knowledge of having been previously exposed to the...
What if you throw in something like Darwin's theory of evolution, and you have literally a species that has not existed before, and that through evolution it comes to be that a new species exists? Would Plato still say that, oh no, you knew that species before?
Yes, I would assume
Well,
so.
it would
Well,
be in accordance with the forms, right? Like
it would, yeah. Well, because you have this architect, so figure who's creating these things, so you would assume that there must have been a form of that species in order for it to appear in the first place. Because for him, there is no reality without the form, right? So it's not like there is no form anywhere, and then they like co-emerge because the one subsists on the other, right? So you just cannot have the new species without the form of it existing anywhere in this other life. And yes, I think you were right about the idea that, for example, potato, right? If you've never seen a potato, well, you would have seen it in your previous life, according to Plato, right? I guess your experience would have never allowed you to have a moment where you could recollect it. Right? You could never have the recollection of that knowledge because you've never seen it in your life. But yes, hypothetically, I should have, for instance, knowledge of all these different forms. And when I do go to a new continent and see a new animal, for example, I should be able to be a little bit reminded, recollected of that.
And there is a distinction as well between the forms are sort of eternal and changeless. They're always the same.
Right.
and then the imitations of the forms in reality, they are changing.
Right.
So that would, to your Darwin example, right? You have a new animal, a new species emerge, right? That's because the material out of which reality is made, which is imitating the forms, is in this state of change. Whereas the forms that it's imitating are not. They're changeless. They're the same, always.
Right. They're imperfect. The particulars are imperfect. Yes. So
yeah.
mutations, I suppose you would say, are exactly what he means by these alterations, which are not present in the perfect forms. Which is quite interesting when you think about it, because okay, so what would the perfect form even look like, right? Maybe it doesn't look that recognizable. Maybe it's a bit different from our experience.
Because he talks in the Timaeus, it talks about fire, water, earth, and air, and how when you try and describe what they are, right, they can change into one another, or fire, was it earth and air make fire, or whatever it is, right? But they change from one to the other, and it's like how when you try and describe them, you're immediately wrong because they change, right? But and that's the stuff that reality's made out of. So it has this. So he's pointing to the issue of categorization in the Timaeus, right? It's like it's difficult. He uses the example of when you're crafting gold, right? So if someone's like smashing gold into a shape, and then someone says, "What is this?" right? And he says, if you were to point at it and say triangle, right, you would at a time be wrong because it will change, right? So you'd be in a better position to say gold than triangle or heart or whatever the shape of gold is. So I think, yeah.
It's very much Heraclitus. I don't know. Have you covered Heraclitus?
Yes. Yeah, we went Heraclitus.
Oh, then yes.
Okay. Well, yes. It's Plato likes his. From what I've seen, he likes his ontology a lot. So, if you want to try and understand like what the world is like from Plato's point of view, these particulars, right? They're very much in flux. They're continually changing, and he doesn't see how that's compatible with the object of knowledge, right? Because presumably knowledge is the truth, right? The truth is something that's infallible, it's real, it's unchanging, right? So you would think that if you know something, right, it would have to be something like that, corresponding with truth. And he says the world that we observe is not like that. So how could we know that, right? How could we know that properly? And he obviously has critiques of sense perception as well, which I think are in the Theaetetus, I think is how it's pronounced. I'm not sure. He has a dialogue on the sense perception as well. But yeah, for Aristotle, it's completely different. In the Categories, which is another text we had to read this week, he makes this distinction. He talks about secondary and primary substance. And for him, primary substance is the particulars. Like it's you, it's me. Right? You know, we are the real beings, right? We are the most real things. So for him, yeah, this generalization, like saying a man or an animal, right? These things are not as real. He sees them as just abstractions.
Right. They're the secondary.
Yes, exactly. They're the secondary substances. But it is interesting that he still correlates them with substance. I would say that was interesting from my point of view. It was a little bit of, again, you're seeing him slightly, trying to find the middle ground here. He's not exactly saying exactly the reverse of Plato, just like I don't think Plato is saying like exactly the reverse of Aristotle. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the differences become more extreme as time progresses between like rationalist and empiricist thinkers.
Fair enough.
I don't have anything to add.
Well, close the book on that.
Should we call it there? What?
Do you?
Do you have anything else that you wanted to add or you wanted to talk about?
No, I think we summed up quite a lot actually.
Yeah.
We're at 59 minutes, so it's a good.
Okay. Yeah.
Just quickly, right? We should do the whole like follow us on social media, send us an email, comments, get in touch. Website, Matthew, what's the website?
That's thenewagora.org.
www.thenewagora.org.
Yes.
What's our Twitter?
I'm assuming the new_agora.
And our Instagram?
Is the new_agora as well. This is a test because I don't normally know this.
What else? What else? What else? Articles. Send us your articles.
Yeah, if you have something that you have a particular interest in, or you want to continue a conversation that we've already started, drop us an email with something that you've written, and we'll post it on our essays and articles page.
And also YouTube, New Agora, and yeah, we're gonna be, in addition to the full videos, uploading clips to make it a little bit more manageable when we have long episodes.
Bit more digestible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you.